Hi there, and welcome to Lesson 3. I'm excited to dive back into another interesting text with you, and more so to see what you think of it after the lecture when we get to the discussion board. So far in this class, we've looked at Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Bible, and now we're turning our attention to the Iliad. You'll probably notice a pattern throughout the course so far where I've paired a longer text with a shorter one. For instance, in Lesson 1, we looked at Gilgamesh, which was rather long, and that short article on the hero's journey to introduce you to our theme for the course. Then in Lesson 2, we looked at the Hebrew Bible, which is, arguably one of the longest and the most complex literary text in the history of the world, and we paired that with a much shorter 100-line poem, Hymn to the Aten. And then now, here in Lesson 3, we're going to look at the Iliad, which is another epic poem like Gilgamesh, and we're pairing the Iliad with Aesop's fables. And so in part 2 of the lecture, we'll go over Aesop, but we're just looking at a few very short fables, and we'll often do that. Most of our lectures will address one of these longer, epic, very famous works from the ancient world, like Gilgamesh or the Iliad, or next time we're going to look at the Odyssey, and then pairing that work with a much shorter reading, some short poems or something, like the fables for part 2 are very short. So that's kind of the plan, so that you're able to have time to take in these big, sprawling, epic texts, but that we still cover 2 authors per lesson, so that we're still moving through all of this ancient material we're supposed to cover throughout the course. So I'm looking forward to discussing the Iliad with you, because this is a fascinating text. Let's jump right in. So we're going to give a little bit of historical background on the text now. We do not really know anything about Homer in terms of his biography, but we do know a great deal about the culture of ancient Greece and about the context surrounding the Iliad regarding how Homer produced this complex and nuanced text. So we're going to go over that. Ancient Greece is a fascinating place, a fascinating culture to study. We're going to spend this lecture and actually the next 2 lectures really immersing ourselves in ancient Greek culture. We're going to spend more time with ancient Greece than any other culture for a few reasons. One being that Greece gave us 2 of the most famous epics in the history of the world, both the Iliad and the Odyssey, but Greece was also known for its drama, its plays. And so we'll spend a lecture on the Iliad and the Odyssey, and in the start of the second half of the quarter, we'll have a couple lessons on Athenian drama from ancient Greece. So we're going to be immersing ourselves in ancient Greek culture for the next month or so. One of the first things you should know about ancient Greece culture is that the society was highly fragmented, and that there were small independent city-states that made up the country of Greece, but these states were very different. They had different values, different priorities, so they were not necessarily super unified. The 2 most prominent examples of this are Sparta and Athens, because these city-states were incredibly different. Sparta was known for its massive land army, whereas the strength of the Athens military was its navy. It had the largest navy of any Greek city-state, but Athens was really known for being the center of philosophy. And so you had this kind of warlike state versus this more intellectual-driven state. And that's just a couple of examples. There were all these different city-states. So when we study ancient Greece, we don't necessarily think of the ancient Greeks as a unified people, but rather we might be looking at a specific city-state. For instance, the Greeks who fight in the Iliad are the Achaeans. They're from that specific city-state. And then later when we study drama, Athens being the center of philosophy is where the plays were written and produced and put on. So we'll take a closer look at the Athenian culture when we get there. In this lecture, we're going to look at the Achaean culture. So that's a little bit about ancient Greece. Like I said, as we go and we study more Greek works, we'll dive into the historical context that's pertinent to that particular Greek work. So now we're going to move on here, and we're going to talk a little bit about Homer, and not so much Homer himself, but how he produced the text of the Iliad. So there were centuries of illiteracy in ancient Greece. We talked in the first lecture about when the alphabetic languages came to Greece and how ancient Greek was one of the first alphabetic languages. But for centuries prior to that, there was widespread illiteracy in ancient Greece. And so there was a thriving oral tradition. Remember how I kicked this class off by talking about the appeal of Netflix and how we all love stories, and we just love, whether it's reading or watching TV or film, we just love consuming stories. And the ancient people of the world were no different when it came to their enjoyment of stories. And so if they couldn't read and they didn't have a TV or a computer, they would tell stories out loud. And so the Iliad was born out of that tradition. Before Homer wrote it down, it was told out loud by many different speakers and authors over centuries in ancient Greece. In terms of its genre, it's an epic poem. So we already studied epic poetry with Gilgamesh. So, that's a good introduction. And this is just a reminder here. Remember that epic poems are long, epic poems that tell a narrative, like a story. And with the translations we have, these translators have worked really hard to make the translations sound as much like modern English in a prose style as possible, while still trying to be as authentic as they can to the original text, while doing that. And so these texts, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Gilgamesh, the Aeneid that we'll read later in the quarter when we study ancient Rome, they read like novels when you're reading them, but keep in mind that in the original language, they were poetry. And that nonetheless told a story. And some of that poetic feel, some of that rhythm and rhyme is still there. A little bit you can detect. Historical context, the Iliad was loosely based on real conflicts between Greeks and parts of Asia Minor. So Troy would be located in modern-day Asia Minor, and there were battles between Greeks and various Asia Minor countries. And so the Homer and the earlier authors of the Iliad kind of took those conflicts and picked one and made it into a story. So it's very close to what today we would call historical fiction. And the oral tradition very much, wanted to remember these battles and why they were significant. And so that's how the Iliad came to be. And along those lines, we also know that Homeric poems, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, make use of folk memories of real conflicts. So, say, for instance, there's a battle between Greek and some country from Asia Minor, maybe Troy, for instance, and it's a really significant battle. And so the people want to remember that battle, and it becomes kind of a legend in their memories, and they tell stories of it out loud, and it becomes like this folk memory. And then eventually Homer writes it down. That's essentially the history of how the Iliad came to be. And so there's this, on one hand, there's this real conflict that did take place, but at the point of the text we have that Homer composed, we've gone pretty far from that real conflict, and now we're more in the territory of folk memory. So Homer's poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, have more to do with what the Greek people thought of that battle and how they remembered it, rather than the actual events that took place. So we shouldn't read them for historical accuracy, but rather read them to gain a better understanding of the Greek culture and what the Greeks valued. Another way of saying that would be that the world of Homer is neither purely historical nor purely fictional. That's how the textbook describes what I just said. And so it's certainly not purely historical. It's more fictional than historical, but it's also not purely fictional. There is some historical basis. And like I said, I think kind of the middle ground there, the thing we should remember most from this is that what it's really giving us insight to is ancient Greek culture. So in that sense, it's historical, even if it's not historically accurate about the actual events. It's historically accurate about the people and why they believe those events were important. And so in that sense, that's what we think of today as historical fiction. Through poetry, the Greeks created and preserved their own past. This is a really interesting point because the Greeks were some of the first people to have written texts. Gilgamesh is an example, but Gilgamesh is not very cohesive. It's the earliest thing we have written down, but it was told by the story was told and written by a number of different societies over the years, centuries really, and now we have, just kind of one version of it, and there were many different versions. Whereas the Iliad, it was told over centuries by different people and then eventually written down, but those people were all part of the same society, Greek culture. And so you have these real conflicts the Greeks would tell about, but they were able to kind of put their spin on them, the meeting of the historical and the fictional. And so in a way, they were creating their culture when they told the stories in a certain way about these real battles. And then when the alphabetic language came to Greece and Homer wrote them down, they then preserved that historical past that they had, in a sense, created through storytelling. And that's incredibly unique for a culture. And it gives us a window into Greek culture that we don't have to other ancient societies from around the same time. And this really connects to my teaching philosophy in the class, where I said culture informs literature, while literature simultaneously informs culture, because you have the cultural influence of the actual battles on the Greeks, and then you have the literary influence of the Greeks creating and preserving their own past, and people still studying and reading the Iliad today. So it's a pretty fascinating achievement that really illustrates, why literature is important and why we should read it. And I've tried to convey that through my teaching philosophy for the class. Okay, so another thing to know about the Iliad is that it's this long, sprawling narrative, but it only takes place over I think it's about 4 days. It's just a few days, less than a week. Although in Greek mythology and folk legend, the Trojan War lasted about 10 years. And so Homer's goal in composing the Iliad is not to give us a portrait, a chronological telling of what happened in the Trojan War. It's rather really to focus on the development of Achilles' character. And so we see 4 days, 4 specific days near the end of the war, late in the 10th year, and we see a number of characters, but it focuses more so on Achilles than anyone else. So the Iliad is really a story about Achilles that's situated within the context of this 10-year-long war. We don't really know if it was 10 years. Like I said, there were a lot of kind of seemingly random conflicts between Greece and Asia Minor, and this was one of them. But in the folk legend, in the oral legend that people would tell out loud, it came to be understood that the war was 10 years. That's kind of the creating of the past I mentioned. But when Homer went and wrote it down, he didn't decide to tell the whole 10-year thing. He decided to just focus on Achilles for 4 days. So that's important to know, because I think a lot of people who haven't read the Iliad but know of it assume it chronicles the whole war, and that's not the case. It's all about Achilles' character development. So even though it's all about his character development, it's still this sprawling, long text, and we're just reading part of it. So what I want to do to try to help you with it is, over the next few slides, just real quickly summarize all of the events that happen, all of the main ones, so that you have a really good outline of the plot. And then the few chapters or books you've read will kind of make sense within that larger context. But this is such a complicated text with such a complicated history that before we even get to the events of the 4 days during which the story takes place, I want to outline the Trojan War as it was understood in Greek mythology and folklore, because you probably know some things about the Trojan War today, and you're probably expecting to see those things in the text. So I want to first outline what those things are and say these things were part of the legend, and you probably or may know of them, but they're not part of the immediate story, the Iliad we're reading, to help parse everything out so it's all very clear. So these are events from Greek folklore, legend, and mythology that inform the context of the Iliad, but are not actually part of the actual story of the Iliad. So it starts with Zeus, the king of the gods, appointing Paris of Troy to judge which goddess is most beautiful. And Aphrodite, she's one of 3 goddesses he's supposed to judge, chooses him, kind of convinces him to pick her by offering Helen of Troy, or Helen of Greece, as Zeus's daughter, and considered by many to be the most beautiful woman in the world, Paris. So she says, if you pick me as the winner of this contest, I will give you Helen as your bride. And so, of course, he picks her, and that's the first event. It's kind of the catalyst for the war. Now, I want to be really clear on this point. As we're trying to understand Greek culture, the relationship between the gods and the goddesses in Greek society is incredibly important, very similar to in Gilgamesh, so we can use that as kind of a reference. You know, it's another example of a polytheistic culture. But if you've seen the movie Troy or other like Hollywood type dramatizations of this, they make it seem like, oh, Paris fell in love with Helen and Helen fell in love with Paris, and it's this romantic thing he does. That's not how it happened. It's not a Romeo and Juliet story. It's the gods and goddesses intervening and bribing humans because of their own pride and self-focus, and then a man kidnapping a woman because he believes he has a right to her based on what a goddess told him. And so the next thing that happens is Paris steals Helen. They don't run away together because they love each other. He kidnaps her. He abducts her. And her husband, Menelaus, is the king of Sparta. And so he, and I think it's his cousin or his relative Agamemnon, who's the king of the Achaeans, they launched this response with 1,000 ships. Helen was the face that launched 1,000 ships. They go to Troy to get her back, and so the war starts. But I just, Greek culture is so different from our culture today and so different from the kind of culture that Hollywood glorifies. I just want to make sure we know this important difference that, it's not a love story. Romance was typically not part of ancient epic poetry. Couple other things to know. Thetis is Achilles' mother. His father was a human, so he's half god, but his mother, the parent that is a goddess, foretells that he will gain glory but die early. So as we go, fate is incredibly important in ancient Greek society. And so another important theme in ancient Greek culture is glory. And so winning glory in battle was great. And so, but people often heard prophecies about themselves and believed those prophecies would come true no matter what. And in the literature, that's often what happens. The prophecy does come true. And so the prophecy Achilles' mother hears that she then tells to him is that he will achieve all of this glory in battle. He'll be one of the greatest warriors ever, but he'll die an early death. And we don't see his death in the Iliad. It ends before his death occurs. But in the Greek folklore and mythology, that is what happened. Paris' arrow hits Achilles in the heel. Part of this prophecy was his mother dipped him in a river, a mythical river, when he was young, thinking it would make him invincible, and she held him by his heel. And so every part of him except his heel touched the river, and so he's invincible except for in his heel. And that's where the phrase Achilles' heel comes from. Today, when we speak of someone who's very strong, having only one weakness, we say that's that person's Achilles' heel. That's where that expression comes from. And he is eventually undone by being vulnerable in his heel. And this is a very well-known legend, but again, it's not part of the actual story of the Iliad. It's part of the larger mythological context surrounding the Iliad. Finally, the other famous thing from The Trojan War that we still talk about today is the Trojan horse, which is where the Greeks pretended to be offering a ceasefire and sent in a wooden horse to the Trojans as a gift, that all their soldiers were hiding inside it, and they came out of it and ambushed them. Again, and this is how, in Greek legend, the Trojan War ended in the fall of Troy, which we'll see depicted in the Aeneid later in the quarter. As Troy burns and people flee, that's because the Greek soldiers have come out of the horse and attacked. So again, we don't see this in the Iliad, but you've probably heard it, and people who were reading Homer would have known this was part of the legend, so it's important context. And then the other thing to know is that the one who came up with this brilliant tactical strategy is Odysseus. Odysseus is kind of a minor character or a side character in the Iliad, who eventually gets his own story in the second epic poem by Homer, which we'll read next time, the Odyssey, which is about Odysseus' journey home from the war. And we have basically two epic poems about two protagonists, Achilles and Odysseus, who are very different. So it's important to study those differences to understand both the better. And while Achilles is the great warrior and Odysseus is a fine soldier himself, what Odysseus is really skilled in and known for is he's a strategist, he's cunning, he's intelligent. And so he comes up with the strategy, that ends the war and leads the Greeks to victory. But again, in how it relates to the slide, it's just context. It's not actually part of the story, part of the larger story surrounding the story. And of course, these events are precipitated by the gods. They wouldn't happen without the gods. The gods cause them to happen, as we see with that first point, which is really important to understand about Greek mythology, because the Hollywood movie Troy doesn't even have the gods in it. Okay, so those are the things that happened in the legend of the Trojan War that Homer leaves out of the Iliad because it only spans 4 days in the 10th year of the war. But we're only reading about 4 of the 24 books. So before we do the close reading, I want to give you an overview of what happens in the Iliad, like just real quickly outline its plot for you. So these are the events that take place just in the Iliad itself. Over again, those few days, they're not the final days of the war, but they're close to it. So the thing that starts it all off is after a victory, whether they defeat a city or a town or a fort or something, the Greek soldiers will take trophies like prizes. And these prizes are usually women who are referred to as spoils of war. And so this was just kind of a barbaric custom from back then, you could say, that for, most countries would not be part of military strategy today. It's very similar what the Vikings did when you hear the term pillaging. And so after this battle that happens just before the text starts, after the Greeks win that battle, Agamemnon takes one of the women from the town they conquer, Chryses, to be his trophy or spoil of war, and Achilles takes Briseis, a woman whose name rhymes with the other one, as his trophy or spoil of war. But Chryses' father is a priest, and they're not supposed to take the children of priests. So Chryses, her father, prays to the god Apollo for the safe return of his daughter. So Apollo sets a plague upon the Greeks, with the understanding that the Greeks will be ill and sick from this plague until Agamemnon, the king and leader of the king of the Achaeans and the leader of this Greek army that's laying siege to Troy, until he returns Chryses to her father. And so Agamemnon does that because he has to, essentially, but he's very prideful and is kind of acting like a child who took his toy away. He's, now I have to give up my trophy, my spoil of war. So he takes Briseis from Achilles, and Achilles also responds like Agamemnon, like a child who's had his toy taken away, and he becomes outraged. The first book is called The Rage or the Wrath of Achilles, depending on which translation you're reading. And the wrath or rage of Achilles is really the driving force of the plot. These first few bullet points are the context to lead up to showing why Achilles' wrath is unleashed. And it's kind of important that these women, these trophies, are taken away, but it's not that important. What's really important here to remember is that, at least to understanding the text, understanding Greek culture, I'm not saying it's not important at all, but what's most important here to understanding the text, understanding Greek culture, is that pride is this huge factor. So Agamemnon and Achilles are both incredibly prideful. When someone says you have to give up something, the other person says, how dare you say that I give something up? These men are leaders and great warriors, so their heads are huge. Their sense of self-importance is incredibly inflated. And even if it's for the good of the people, to end a plague that's affecting their people, they're still going to put themselves first and act prideful and say, how dare you suggest I give up something that is mine? And I want to make this point about pride really clear. Again, to come back to the movie adaptation. In the movie, the filmmakers make it seem as if Achilles is in love with Briseis, and that's the driving force of his wrath. Whereas in the Iliad, Briseis they do seem to care for each other when he has to give her up, but she's only in this one scene in book one. And his wrath is not about love, it's about pride. Again, because love and romance were not really part of Greek epics. It's really several thousand years later, during the Middle Ages, when the tradition of romance in literature is born. But of course, because it's Hollywood, they want to make it all about love. So I just wanted to point out that very important difference. So what happens once Achilles' pride is wounded here and his wrath is unleashed? Achilles then refuses to fight. He pulls himself out of the war. Now you have to think about this. Achilles is half god, whereas the rest of the soldiers are mortal men. So he is far and away their best fighter. He's very similar to Gilgamesh in this sense. And they've been winning the war against the Trojans, and it's nearly over on the part of the strength of Achilles. And so by taking himself out of the war, he's doing a huge disservice to his people and hurting them. Kind of like Agamemnon. If Agamemnon had refused to give up Chryses, the plague still would have been hurting them. Achilles is so prideful. His pride is so wounded here that he chooses to unleash his wrath on his own people and hold himself out of the war so that he knows they'll start losing. He also appeals to his mother, for whom Zeus has kind of a soft spot, to kind of flirt with Zeus a little bit and be like, hey, why don't you aid the Trojans? So he actually appeals to his mother, who's a goddess, to help the other side in the war. So he pulls himself out of the war and has the gods help aid the other side. And so the Greeks are just dying here. They're just losing the battle that they were winning before, all because of Achilles' wrath and pride. And so this is all established in book one, from the very beginning, book one of 24 books. So you know this going into the rest of the poem. And so you see basically how Achilles' wrath unfolds as the story goes on. So some other key things that happen. Odysseus tries to convince Achilles to return to combat. And Odysseus, remember, he's the strategist, the cunning one, the smart one, who gets his own story in the next poem. So he's also the best speaker because he's incredibly smart. So he's incredibly persuasive. And so he tries to convince Achilles to return to combat. And by the point of book 9, which is where Odysseus has his big famous speech, he says, at that point, the Greeks are doing so poorly and they need Achilles so badly. Agamemnon tells Odysseus, go to Achilles. But he says, give him whatever he wants. He can have Briseis back. He can have every woman from every town we capture. He can have whatever he wants. Give him anything. Just get him back in the battle. And so you have that combined with Odysseus, who is an incredibly good speaker, incredibly persuasive. He could sell ice in Antarctica, Odysseus could, and still, Achilles is so prideful, he will not be swayed. He still decides to just stay in his tent and mope rather than fight because his pride is so wounded. He does have a really good friend, and Patroclus is his really good friend. And Patroclus wants to boost morale. He wants to. He thinks it's maybe not just that Achilles is a good fighter, but that his presence is something that the troops all believe in, and that if Achilles goes back in, that'll just inspire people to fight. And so he puts on Achilles' armor and pretends to be Achilles, and is killed. He thinks that will help. He thinks that'll boost morale, but he's not as good of a fighter as Achilles, even though he's a decent fighter in his own right, and he's killed by Hector, who was the leader and the best fighter of the Trojans. So we'll continue on here with these events. After Patroclus is killed, wearing Achilles' armor, Hector takes Patroclus' body and Achilles' armor from it. And this is the turning point, because Achilles is like best friends with Patroclus. And so, of course, if he's ever going to re-enter the war, it will not be because he gets what he wants or someone persuades him. It'll be for personal vendetta, personal vengeance, because he's prideful and self-focused. And so the gods fashion new armor for Achilles, and then Achilles re-enters the war to avenge Patroclus. So Patroclus' death is the reason, the catalyst that finally sends Achilles back into the war. And again, I want to differentiate between the movie here, because it's not about romance. Achilles and Patroclus are friends. They have the kind of bond soldiers form. They are not lovers. And there's certainly no romance involved in any kind of way. But in the Hollywood movie Troy, they make Patroclus is barely in the movie, if he's there at all, and they make it that Briseis dies, and Briseis dying is the reason Achilles goes back into war. So in the movie, it's still a personal vendetta, but it's a personal vendetta born out of romance, which, again, romance is just not part of it. We're trying to understand a Greek culture very different from our own, and they didn't prioritize romance the way our culture does. And so the real reason and the real text that Achilles re-enters the war is because his good friend, his fellow soldier, has died posing as him. So when he re-enters the war, he faces off with Hector, the leader and best soldier from the Trojans, because Hector is the one who slayed Patroclus. But Achilles slays Hector, and he's so angry, again, his wrath. He's so wrathful that he takes Hector's body and drags it behind his chariot. He abuses and defiles Hector's body, which is incredibly saddening to Hector's parents and his family, his wife, and his children. And so Hector's father, Priam, who's the king of the Trojans, risks his life and crosses behind enemy lines. In the final book, book 24, he crosses behind enemy lines to try to appeal to Achilles to get Hector's body back and give Hector a proper funeral. And what happens is Achilles, in seeing Priam's grief over his son, is able, in this brilliant, rare, unique moment, to make a connection with another human being. Because he's so selfish, he's so self-focused, he's so prideful. Connecting with another human being is almost impossible for him, let alone a human being fighting on the other side in the war. But he nonetheless, when he sees Priam grieving over his son Hector, Achilles thinks of his own grief for his good friend and fellow soldier Patroclus and says, I understand why you're hurting right now. And as much as I want to abuse this body and continue to seek out my wrath and my vengeance, inasmuch as your son killed my friend and that makes me angry, I will give you his body back. I will even hold back the troops because they listen to me, and we won't attack for several days so that you can have a proper funeral and the celebrations and games that go along with a funeral, because that was part of that culture. And so you have this very interesting ending where just in the final book, you see a different side of Achilles as he makes a connection with someone from actually the opposing side in the war, because they're both grieving people they lost to whom they were very close. And so that's how the Iliad ends, because that's the end of the story Homer wanted to tell about Achilles' character. Now, we know from our 2 slides ago all of the other things that happen, but this is the story Homer wanted to tell of Achilles going from being so prideful he would pray that his own soldiers suffer to be willing to give grace to someone on the other side in the war because they have a shared type of grief and suffering. And once again, these events are all precipitated by the gods because it's ancient Greek culture. So there you have the plot overview of the Iliad. I've only asked you to read 4 books. Book 1, which sets everything up. Book 9, which is where Odysseus makes his speech, trying to persuade Achilles to return. Book 22, where Hector and Achilles fight, and Achilles slays Hector and begins defiling his body. And Book 24, which is the ending, where Achilles and Priam talk and share their grief. Because it would be too much to ask you to read the whole thing, and that's still quite a bit, but those are the most important parts. But since I only asked you to read part of it, I wanted to give you this overview of the whole text so that you have a full understanding of the unity of the narrative as a whole. So these are the reading questions I asked you to think about as you read. This is the same question I asked about Gilgamesh and I asked about Jacob, is what do you think of Achilles' character? List out his qualities. Do you like him? Why or why not? That's the question I always ask. And now that we're on to our 3rd story, what do you think of his character compared to Gilgamesh and Jacob? We've got enough protagonists now, 3, that in terms of each of their journeys, we can start to compare them. And then the other reading question has something we haven't really discussed yet, but we should. It's very important to interpreting literature, which is a theme. A theme is kind of like an idea, a belief, something like that, a concept that shows up repeatedly. It keeps recurring throughout the text. And by closely examining that recurring concept or idea and saying, what does this mean? What is the text saying about this? It shows up, it's important. What does the text say about it? That's a great way to interpreting the literature. So what are some of the themes of the Iliad? And I know that's a new idea, so you may not have an answer for this one yet, but we're going to really parse out some of the themes as we do our close reading. So that'll hopefully help. And as usual, feel free to pause here and jot down some of your thoughts. My first question here is, as always, we're going to pull on that thread of what do you think of the main character? And this time I also ask, what do you think of some of the other characters? Because I think, understanding Achilles comes through in a speech of his where we also understand Agamemnon some. Then answered him, swift-footed, godlike Achilles, most honored son of Atreus, of all men, most covetous of possessions. How then can the great-hearted Achaeans give you a prize? We do not know of any great common store laid up anywhere, but those things that we carried from these cities, these have been distributed, and it is not fitting to go about gathering these again from the men. But no, relinquish the girl to the god now. We Achaeans will pay you back 3 times, 4 times over, if ever Zeus gives us the well-walled city of Troy to plunder. Then answering him spoke powerful Agamemnon. Do not, in this way, skilled though you may be, God like Achilles, try to trick me, for you will not outwit nor persuade me. Or do you intend, while you yourself have a prize, that I just sit here without one? Are you ordering me to give the girl back? So this is when, in Book 1, Achilles and Agamemnon are still debating what to do now that a plague is besetting the troops. And Achilles is saying, Agamemnon, you need to give this woman back so that Apollo stops hurting us with this plague. And Agamemnon is saying, you think I'm going to give up my prize? You should have to give up yours. So this is where we see the pride. And if you are sympathetic to Achilles or Agamemnon at all, that'd be surprising but interesting, because they are both just so very prideful, so selfish here. Like I said, they're acting like children with toys, like my kids when I say you have to give this toy up to the other kid, or don't take this toy from your brother or your sister. And so, just incredibly childish. And so this is where we really have like a dislike for Achilles from the beginning. And I think it's really interesting literature. I think, as we've seen with Gilgamesh and Jacob, if you have a character who's not very likable at the start of the story, what happens as you go and you read more of that story and maybe they change some. Another thing to think about here is the importance of words. The textbook says that the Iliad is not just a battle of weapons, but also a battle of words. And so that's one of the themes we'll look at, because in ancient Greek society, speech was incredibly important. And the Greeks basically invented rhetoric, or the art of trying to persuade one through speech. And as I already mentioned in Book 9, you really see that with Odysseus, who's the best orator among them, when he tries to persuade Achilles to rejoin the fight. But here, even though Achilles is known more for his fighting skill than his oration, he still makes a pretty convincing argument. And Agamemnon still picks up on it and says, don't try to trick me with your rhetoric. Because Achilles is appealing to this sense of, he says, we attacked the city, we all took prizes, everyone got their prize. You have to give yours up because the god wants you to. So just give it up for the well-being of your men. Just do it, He's saying we don't have a bunch of prizes stored up, but don't go around taking stuff from men that you've already given them. If we win the war and we win Troy, there'll be splendors, spoils, and trophies aplenty. Don't worry so much about this one trophy from this one battle, this one city. Just give her up so that we are not sick anymore. And Agamemnon says, don't try to trick me. You talk a big talk about giving something up for the better of the troops, but you're not willing yourself to give up your prize, are you? And as we see, Achilles is clearly not. So Achilles is trying to be very persuasive here, and he's pretty clever, but Agamemnon is calling a spade a spade. And so Achilles, this shows the absolute depth of his selfishness, because he is willing to appeal to the sense of do what's right for everyone and sacrifice to yourself, but not willing to carry those actions through himself. He's not going to put his money where his mouth is when it comes to himself, but he still knows enough about what's going on and is wise enough to try to use that argument to convince someone else. So he knows what's good, what's best for the troops, but he's not willing to do that to himself. It shows a lot about Achilles here. It also shows a lot about Agamemnon and about Greek culture. The emphasis on oration, the concern with pride. So I asked, are there any characters who are sympathetic, though? And I think Hector is one. I think Homer does a good job of showing the other side in the war and showing that they're all people fighting each other, because there's scenes in Book 2, which I didn't assign, but you can read if you want, where you see Hector at home with his family, his wife and his children, and he seems like an ordinary guy who's just trying to do his best in his job as the leader of the Trojan military. So I want to take a minute and look at a passage on Hector. But in the passage I've chosen from Book 22, which is right before Achilles and Hector fight and before Achilles kills Hector, this passage has most of the main themes from the Iliad. So I want to list those themes out for you, and then we'll look at them in the passage. So the biggest themes in the Iliad are pride, which you've already talked about, fate, the idea that you can't escape what the gods have ordained for you, which is also part of Achilles' choice, I should have mentioned earlier, to go back into battle. In part, he's destined to die young. So he's staying out of the war because of his pride, and his pride that's been wounded by Agamemnon's assertion that he should give up his trophy. But in essentially that Agamemnon thinking he's better than Achilles is what that means. But he also knows he's fated to die young and gloriously. So he knows if he goes back into the war, he'll have great glory and he'll die. But he thinks if I stay out of the war, maybe I won't die. Maybe I'll be able to avoid this prophecy. But then inevitably he goes back in. It takes something as big as his friend dying. But part of it, I think, is he's saying, well, now I have a personal reason to fight. It kind of was inevitable because of this prophecy. I'll go back in. And so fate, in addition to pride, is very important. There's also the Greek word kleos, which is glory or fame. So, that's pretty obvious. When they have these victories and takes these prizes, they earn all this glory. Time is incredibly important because Achilles is holding himself out of the war. And so as time passes, and more troops are killed, the tensions become higher. As more Greeks are killed and they seem to be losing the war, as Achilles stays out of it, Agamemnon is more willing to swallow his pride and to give to at least offer Achilles what he wants, even though Achilles doesn't take it. And so, in a sense, Achilles, through his power, is controlling the narrative, controlling how the passage of time affects the other characters. And lastly, the fifth really important theme is the Greek word menace, or wrath, or rage. So the menace of Achilles is the name of book 1. The book that sets the stage for everything, and scholars often translate that Greek word menace as either wrath or rage. And so we've already talked about this extensively, but Achilles' wrath is what's causing him to influence the time and is born out of his pride. So these are the 5 big themes of the Iliad, and we'll talk about them more. But right now we're going to look at them in this quote about Hector, because I want to just spend some time with Hector's character. And we need to explore these themes, and they show up in this wonderful quote about Hector. And it starts with him. He's basically going to fight Achilles. And again, because of fate and prophecy, the gods have basically said the Trojans are going to lose the war. So Hector and the Trojans here have kind of a fatalistic mindset that they're not going to win the war, especially now that Achilles is back in it. So Hector is kind of convincing himself he has to go face off with Achilles, that he's fated to do this. And his parents are weeping because they know he's probably going to die, because he's their best warrior, but he's about to fight a man who is half god. Thus both of them weeping addressed their dear son, repeatedly beseeching. But they did not persuade the heart of Hector, and he awaited Achilles, who was looming huge as he drew near, as a snake by its hold in the mountains waits for a man, having eaten evil poisons, and a deadly anger comes upon it, and it shoots a stinging glance, coiled by its hole. So Hector, keeping his spirit unquelled, did not retreat, but having leaned his shining shield against the jutting tower, in agitation he spoke to his great-hearted spirit. O me, if I enter the gates and walls, now since I have destroyed my people by my recklessness, I dread the Trojan men and the Trojan women with their trailing robes. Lest some other man more worthless than me say, Hector, trusting in his strength, destroyed his people. Thus they will speak. It would be far better, then, for me to confront Achilles, either to kill him and return home, or to die with honor at his hands before my city. So, like I said, fate plays a big role here, because Hector knows he's probably going to die, but he knows the Trojans are probably going to lose, and he has a wife and children, so it might be wiser for him to be at home. But he's the best shot the Trojans have. And he's already, defeated Menelaus, so maybe he can defeat Achilles. But even if he doesn't, he'll die gloriously, and what is fated to come to be will come to be. So this really encapsulates the mentality of the Greek military culture at the time. Glory in battle is very important. One cannot escape fate. And here, Hector has the weight of his people on his shoulders. So this really gives us an insight to Hector and how he's, a great soldier, but a regular person. and he's doing the best he can, but he's in this context, this culture where, the gods are more powerful than the humans and they decide things, and he's facing off with a man who's part God. And so best case scenario, he wins and returns home. Worst case scenario, he dies, but he dies with honor and glory, and it was kind of expected anyway. So just a snapshot of Hector and a snapshot of Greek culture as you think through these things. We're going to look at one more slide, or one more quote, before we finish up and go to the last slide with the questions for the discussion board. And I think this is the biggest question, because it's Achilles. Is he on a hero's journey? Do you see some of the hero's journey here? And because the hero's journey is all about the inner growth that matches the outward change, and do you see any change or growth in Achilles by the end of the narrative? And so this quote is after Priam, Hector's father, has sneaked through the enemy lines and has Achilles is willing to give him an audience, willing to talk to him, because he's impressed that this old man was able to sneak past the troops, risk his life, and reach Achilles' tent. This is as they're talking. But when godlike Achilles had taken his fill of lamentation, and the yearning had gone from his breast and his very limbs, he rose suddenly from his seat and raised the old man by the hand, pitying his gray head and gray beard, and lifting his voice he addressed him with winged word. Poor soul, surely you have endured much evil in your heart. How did you dare go to the Achaean ships alone, and to the side of a man who killed your many and your noble sons? Your heart is iron. But come and seat yourself upon the chair, and let us leave these sorrows, lying undisturbed within our hearts, grieving though we are, for there is no profit in grief that numbs the heart. So it's really interesting. This quote, I think, as I said before, they have a shared sense of grief. And he's saying, let not grief numb the heart. And so it's important here, fellow feeling between men, between soldiers who've both lost someone they love, a best friend and a son. And so, the fact that Achilles can have a conversation like this with anyone, let alone someone from the other side, is really significant. And that he's saying it's important what's in both of our hearts. The fellow feeling of another person is important. At book one, that would have been anathema to Achilles, but since then, he's, seen his best friend die. So just a really interesting ending to think about. You can certainly think about it on the discussion board. So here are a few questions to ponder as you go from the next level of critical thinking, from the reading to the lesson to the part where you now get creative on the discussion board. So in addition to a battle of weapons, in what ways is the Iliad a battle of words? I mentioned this already, that oration, speaking, is very important. We saw Achilles being clever, trying to be slick, trying to persuade Agamemnon in book 1. And we didn't look at a quote from it, but you also read book 9, which has some of the best speeches in the book when Odysseus and others try to convince Achilles to rejoin the war. So if you're interested in the speeches of the Iliad, you've got a lot to draw on in what we read if you want to pursue this question. Pick one of the following themes and explore how it is important to understanding the Iliad. So pride, fate, glory, time, or wrath. Those are the 5 big themes. And so I only have 3 questions total here, because this is really like 5 questions in one. So it's really like 7 rather than 3 questions. I was just able to condense 5 of those questions to 1 bullet point. So you can identify a theme. You can say pride or fate or glory or time or wrath is important. But to answer this question, thinking a step further, you have to say, how is this important? What is Homer saying about it? From the text, what can we glean as the text's opinion about rage, or about glory, or about pride? Is pride a good thing or a bad thing? So it's going a step beyond identifying the theme to saying, what do we think the text message about the theme is? Finally, do you see any significant change or growth in Achilles' character by the end? We just talked about this. I think it's the most important question. You can bring the hero's journey into this question if you want to. You don't have to. And don't feel like I've already answered it. This is something scholars hotly debate, and I want to hear your opinion, because there's no denying that it's significant that Achilles recognizes the common grief he and Priam share, and that he's willing to give up his vendetta on Hector's body to help out another person. But is that significant change or growth? It's change and growth, but how significant is it? Because some people say, this is amazing. Look at how much he's changed from book one. And others say, it's too little, too late. This one little moment. He's still a very prideful guy. So how important is that last scene? It's very important, but how much does Achilles really change or not? So great questions. We're really looking forward to hearing what you think of them. Hope you enjoyed the Iliad. Have a great day.